Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second talk in our New Voices on Eurasia series, sponsored by PONARS Eurasia here at George Washington University. My name is David Ciccone. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at GW. And I'm pleased to welcome Anton Shirikov, who's a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, to deliver a talk on media and propaganda. For those people that may be new to the series, New Voices on Eurasia brings together some of the leading junior scholars from across the country who are working on a variety of issues related to Eurasian politics, society, economics, and so forth throughout the year. It'll be mostly a monthly talk until April, and we encourage you to check out the schedule and join us with future iterations. But today we're delighted to have Anton, who recently received his PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and is an expert on all things related to communications and information. He used to be an editor and journalist for an independent media outlet in Russia before starting his PhD, and has published widely, especially for someone at his stage in his career, great publications in the Quarterly Journal of Political Science and Journal of Legislative Studies, too. I rely on very closely. So Anton's going to be giving a talk today for about half the time, and I think he's open to questions throughout the talk. So please, if something strikes you as helping or needing to be clarified, or you have other type of responses to his talk, please feel free to chime in. And afterwards, we'll open it up to a full question and answer for the remaining part of the time before we leave at 5 p.m. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Anton. Thank you so much for coming.
Hi, thank you so much, David, for the introduction, and thanks, David, Marlene, and Henry, and PONARS for inviting me to this wonderful series. It's really a pleasure to be here at GW. It's my first time. It's a wonderful place. So I will talk about why Russians are so enthralled by Putin's propaganda, and why they're so averse to independent media, independent reporting. And as David mentioned, for me, this is not just a topic of scholarly interest, this is also personal. So in a way, trying to understand why this is happening is for me a way to get back at Putin for his efforts in terms of destruction of Russian journalism. I don't know if that's going to help anyone, but yeah, that's part of my motivation. So this talk today is focused on the mechanisms of Kremlin's domestic propaganda, and I will try to tell you to explain why it works so effectively, why people are so attentive to it, and that requires answering several more specific questions, such as who is more exposed to propaganda, and what conditions, what channels people are exposed to, and how well they recognize disinformation sponsored by the Kremlin. So I will talk about all these questions using evidence from my recent surveys I fielded through the past 2 or 3 years. And at the end, I will talk about what we should expect for propaganda going forward, whether we should expect it to lose its power at some point, and what this all means for understanding war in Ukraine. So first, just very briefly, to give you some context or bring you up to speed. So you're probably aware that the government controls most of Russian media outlets. And most recently, especially after the war started, state television turned into a nonstop propaganda machine that has up to 80 hours a week of news broadcasts and political talk shows, or rather propaganda disguised as broadcasts and political talk shows. And there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation that's invented by the Kremlin about how the war is going. There's a lot of denials. And also there's a lot of fawning over Putin and this relentless demonstration of, the nation being united in support for Putin and for the war. State television takes the lead on this, sets the tone, but all other state-controlled outlets usually follow this line as well, sometimes pretending to be more neutral, more balanced, but basically just following the same pattern. As for independent media, unfortunately have been playing a marginal role for many years. And before the invasion, there were dozens of them available to Russians, but they were threatened, attacked, prosecuted in any way you can imagine. They persisted despite that, but they had a small audience. So just to give you a sense of that, according to recent analysis, the combined visits to websites of all sort of notable independent media were about 100 million visits per month, whereas a single state news agency, RIA Novosti, had 150 million visits. So one state agency had more reach than all the independent media combined. And the situation got even worse in 2022 after the invasion started, when the government criminalized reporting about the war and just saying the truth about the war, so you can go to prison for that. But it also proceeded to block or shut down most of the remaining independent outlets. And of course, most of them, or many of them, moved abroad and continued reporting, but they are not available to Russians unless you have a VPN and you are trying to go around those blockings. And in general, you can see on this figure, the government engaged in a very intensive censorship this year. In some months, they were blocking by 20,000 websites a month. Of course, not all of them are media, most of them are not media, but that illustrates the amount of censorship. And what currently remains is a couple of social media platforms, including YouTube and Telegram. And on these platforms, independent voices are present, they're visible. And there are also several state-controlled or sort of indirectly state-controlled news outlets that present themselves as neutral. So you can learn something from them, but you cannot learn really the truth about the war from those outlets, like Kommersant, formerly a very prestigious newspaper in Russia. So that's what happened in this year. But interestingly, most Russians haven't noticed. Levada Center, which is Russia's remaining independent pollster, in August asked people whether they have noticed any changes in the coverage of news outlets that they trust or that they consume after this military censorship was instituted. And most people, 60%, said they didn't notice any changes. Nothing changed for them. And 20% actually said that after the censorship, there's more information about the war, interestingly. So only very small minorities said that there is less information, or that the websites that they were using stopped reporting or were blocked or were closed. And more generally, I think we have plenty of evidence now that Russians have been going along with the Kremlin's narrative, both about the war in Ukraine and more generally, the political narrative. You might remember some of the stories from the beginning of the war about Russians who had Ukrainian families or Ukrainian relatives. And in those stories, Russians, when talking to their Ukrainian families, they were just in complete denial of the war. When Ukrainians told them, "We are being bombed, we're being shelled," Russians responded, "No, it's some confusion on your part, or it's the Ukrainian army that's doing that. It's your own army that's bombing you." Of course, these were extreme cases, and I think right now, when more information is seeping in, most Russians are not that blind to the war, but still, many of them, it's hard to say how many, possibly a majority, but a lot of people generally believe that this war is at least necessary, or maybe even just and unfair. And I've had, my own share of conversations like that with some of my relatives back in Russia, when I was trying to challenge some of the views that they reproduced, the positions basically promoted by propaganda. They told me that it's me who is brainwashed by propaganda, and by propaganda they meant Western media. So how did we get there? How did Russians turn out to be so in this grip, so much in this grip of propaganda? Well, I will talk about several explanations that made this sort of reality possible. And first of them is that state media create an information bubble that does not allow any competing or alternative narratives to go through. But the second thing is that this bubble is actually very attractive to many Russians, and they just don't want to leave it. Third, if we look at how people in Russia go about news processing, about deciding whether news story is true or false, it turns out, and my research shows, that they are not very good, and sometimes quite bad, at judging information and distinguishing between truth and falsehoods. And finally, the specific bits of disinformation that the Kremlin is promoting are themselves quite attractive to Russians. So let's start with the first one. I think it is probably not very controversial, and most of you probably know this, that Kremlin, as I already mentioned, controls a lot of Russian media. And so most media that Russians consume are these vehicles for propaganda. But it's still useful to look at some numbers here to understand the deepness of this problem. First, still about 60%, or a bit more than 60% of Russians learn news from state TV. For them, it's the primary or the only source of information. And you might think that if you go online, then things would be better, because online you have access to more diverse views, more diverse media. And this was before the war, so when those media, when independent alternative media were freely available. Even so, the overwhelming number of Russians were using state media online. So about 80% of them were using at least one state media outlet, and on average, an average respondent in my online surveys, I used 3 different state media outlets. So paradoxically, if you are online, you are even more likely to be exposed to state narratives. And in contrast, only about 20% of those people that I surveyed reported trust of using any independent news outlets. And this is a problem. This is obviously a problem in terms of it does not, this sort of bubble, it does not let through any alternative ideas. And it is actually even more encompassing if you think about people being on social media or being involved in in-person conversations. And in those conversations, people are even more likely to be exposed to propaganda narratives, because others who they talk to are also exposed to state media. So it's even worse. But there is also somewhat more subtle problem here, which is no less serious, which is this bubble creates an illusion that state media are credible. So how this works? Usually when we think about news information that we read somewhere or hear somewhere, how do we decide whether this information is true or not? We often look for confirmation or for verification in other sources. We might Google it, or we might go to another source that we trust and check it. And that is completely reasonable, and that's what a lot of Russians do. I mean, in my surveys, for example, about 80% said when evaluating different news stories, they made their decisions based on whether they heard the story before or not, or based on whether they searched for it online and found some confirmation. But the problem here is that there's a lot of state media outlets, and all of them present a more or less consistent narrative. So they are guided by the Kremlin. They are these messages are coordinated by the Kremlin, and as a result, what we have is that people read a story, they go online, they check another outlet, but it tells the same story. They check another outlet, it also tells the same story, or they go to Yandex, which is Russia's most popular search engine, which is controlled by the government indirectly. And what it will show you, it will only show you state-controlled media. So you search for it, again, you find confirmation. And as you do this, every day, over time, you get the impression that these news outlets that the state controls are pretty trustworthy because their information checks out. So you rest assured you're getting the correct picture. And essentially, this is the way in which these untrustworthy outlets are making each other look credible. creating credibility out of nowhere, essentially. And as a result, what we have is that in my work surveys that I got, about 75% of people who are online said they trust at least some state media or named state media outlets among the trusted media, and only 15–20% talked about trusting independent news outlets. And there's also a substantial group of people, 25–30%, that specifically bring up state media, such as RIA Novosti that I mentioned, or Izvestia, which is a popular newspaper. So when they evaluate news stories, they say, oh, I know Izvestia, this is a serious source, this is an authoritative source, so I will trust this story. The other problem, though, is that Russians are generally attracted to the narratives that state media present. And I will just go through this kind of briefly. This attraction is rooted in support for Putin and in identifying with the ideas, with the feelings, with emotions that Putin and his supporters share. So basically, propaganda makes itself trustworthy by showing that it shares the same narratives, that it appeals to the same narratives. Whereas if you look at independent media, those media usually present something that goes contrary to these ideas and narratives, and so they are much less trusted. So to be more concrete, what I mean is a lot of trust in propaganda is based on propaganda's emphasis on this post-Soviet identity and the feelings that are related to the collapse of the Soviet Union. As I mentioned here in recent surveys, almost 2/3 of Russians said that they regret the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the reasons are pretty clear. In the 1990s, Russia faced economic disarray, social disruption, a lot of instability, and it lost essentially its great power status. So, so these things are very traumatic for a lot of Russians, even for those people who haven't actually experienced that, or at least for some of them. And there is a common narrative that the West is at fault, that NATO or the United States are at fault. And propaganda has been, to Putin, very much used these grievances and these emotions when building his own base of support. And propaganda is also playing into these feelings itself. And by doing that, it presents this comforting story that Russians are a kind, peaceful, heroic nation. It always brings up this memories of World War II, and around which Putin has built another cult, essentially. And by focusing on these ideas, by showing this comforting coverage, propaganda signals that it is trustworthy, it is on the citizen side, it is not trying to manipulate them, it is rooting for them and for Russia's success. On the other hand, if you look at independent media, critical media, they usually focus on topics that are problematic, be it the Soviet rule or contemporary Putin's rule. These topics like electoral fraud, police brutality, persecution of minorities. Focusing on these problems, of course, appeals to people who are strong opponents of Putin, who are pro-Western liberals, but these are very generally a small minority in Russia. And to the pro-Putin majority, these topics can seem either irrelevant or, in some cases, insulting. So they might find this media, and they actually do, hostile. They talk about them as foreign agents, and this designation appeared fairly recently, but many Russians have thought about some key independent media in this way for quite a long time. So as a result, what we have is that the perceptions of state and independent media are quite polarized. Among people who are supporting Putin, more than 2/3 say that they trust state media, and almost no one says that they trust independent media. Whereas among Putin critics, this is somewhat reversed. So people who are opposition-minded, only a minority of them say they trust state television, although they still do. Some still do. and many more of them trust independent media. So this is a situation which some communication scholars or other scholars call an echo chamber, right? When you are using media outlets, news sources that basically repeat your beliefs back to you, and that on the one hand reinforces those beliefs, but also over time reinforces trust in those outlets. And just these two things, trust in propaganda and this pro-regime or pro-imperial, pro-Russian beliefs, they reinforce each other in this echo chamber. That's the problem, or one of the problems here. At the same time, what I want to emphasize is that people who are Putin supporters are not entirely naive about this media. So I asked them, for example, what they think about Russia 24, which is the most popular TV channel right now, and probably a source of most aggressive disinformation about Ukraine, about the war. And among those people, among Putin supporters, only a minority, about 40% agree that these media are politically neutral or independent from the government. So most people, excuse me, most people understand that these media are an instrument in the government's hands. But at the same time, most of them, 60–70%, still say that these media produce accurate reporting. They do not lie generally, and that there is no censorship. They report all important news stories. So what this means is that this political affinity, this sort of polarization mechanism, it produces or it forces people who are supportive of Putin to underestimate how much disinformation they're getting, how biased this media, state media are. Now let me switch gears a little bit and talk about something different. The third reason why it may be so easy for Putin's propaganda to work is that Russians are generally not that great at recognizing misinformation. So there is this, narrative that's common among some scholars of autocracies that people can extract information from propaganda. People can discern the bias. People can understand what's going on because they have a lot of experience with that. But I've already shown you that there is not much skepticism about state media, but also there is fairly little capacity to recognize false stories when people see them. So in my research, I consistently find that between 50 and 60% of Russians, or my Russian respondents, can recognize fake stories in about 50–60% of the cases. And this is worse than in democracies like the United States or UK, where this percentage is usually between 60 and 70%, according to recent work. So it's not dramatically worse, but it's still worse. So Russians are not those sophisticated news consumers, as some imagine. I've also compared their news capacity to that of Ukrainians who participated in one of my surveys, and Ukrainians did a bit better evaluating the same news stories. So that might tell us something about the differences in the news environment. Maybe it's something else. But also people who consume state media are also doing somewhat worse than people who do not. And as in addition, if we sometimes we might think that, okay, maybe they're not that great when recognizing false stories, but when it comes to outright propaganda, when it comes to direct disinformation by the Kremlin, people might still be able to, might still be more sensitive to it, might still recognize it. But here, the situation is somewhat similar to what I've shown you before with the perceptions of state and independent media. There is substantial polarization, and people who are pro-Putin are doing substantially worse, which should not be a surprise. I guess, given what I said before, they're doing substantially worse than people who are not pro-Putin when it comes to pro-regime falsehoods. So they are much more likely to fall victim to those news stories. And people who use state media regularly also do worse. So that suggests that again, that information environment in which you are in may play some role here. And I'm not claiming, any for political scientists, I'm not claiming a causal connection here necessarily, but this is just something to remember, that people are pretty bad at recognizing those falsehoods that the Kremlin promotes. And here are some examples, right? So 2 stories in the top here, because of anti-Russian sanctions, European Union has lost €500 billion. And in California, divorced husband and wife are banned because of same-sex marriages. So these are falsehoods that were promoted by Russian state media. But among Putin supporters, 62 and 73% correspondingly found those stories to be true. So they are very much prone to those kinds of falsehoods. But at the same time, the problem is also that when it comes to true critical messages, like here, for example, the Ukrainian economy has been growing faster than the Russian economy, and Putin gave himself lifetime immunity from prosecution. Only 14 to 16% of Russians believe those Russians who are pro-Putin believe those stories. So this suggests that people who are saying, we should just get the true information, we need to make Russians just hear the truth, and then that will change how they think about the regime. But they just don't believe those kinds of stories. That's the problem. I would caution, however, against using this term brainwashing. We heard a lot of stories about that. Russians have been brainwashed into supporting the war just because they heard this pro-regime narratives a lot. That's why they are so prone to them. And of course, the repetition plays some role here. But the main problem is that people were already predisposed to to believe those stories. It's not that they were just out of nowhere, they were brainwashed into believing them. So when it came to the beliefs that they already had, like anti-Western sentiment, this disdain and condescending attitude towards Ukrainians and other nations who were in the Soviet Union, this post-Soviet trauma, and even a personal connection to Putin. When it comes to this, propaganda has been pretty effective, and that's how it was able to sell this whole Ukraine story, by very gradually integrating the narrative about Ukraine with all those ideas, with all those sentiments. But in other situations, when the Kremlin has actually tried to change people's minds, for example, about the pension reform in 2018, or about COVID, about vaccination, it usually failed because people had have this deeply ingrained trust toward government bureaucracy, and despite months of campaigns for this reform, for anti-COVID measures, it was very difficult to make Russians change change this sort of beliefs and become more trusting and become more willing to vaccinate, for example. Until now, the vaccination rate remains pretty low. And the same thing happened with the so-called partial mobilization in September. And propaganda was saying, well, only a small proportion of people will be mobilized, and only those with military experience, only those with military profession. But people just didn't believe that. We saw this very long lines at the border of Georgia and Kazakhstan. Russians just fled country en masse. So this suggests that people have actually more agency than the common narratives about propaganda suggest. And it's really hard to make them believe something they don't want to believe. So in terms of thinking about what we should see next, and when propaganda will actually lose its power, so there are 2 things to remember. Like, on the one hand, there is higher demand for alternative information right now. There is many more people are using VPNs now. Basically, no one used it before the war, but now it's about a quarter of population, and it's mostly younger people, but still, more people are using YouTube and Telegram partly because they have access to independent voices over there. The audience of independent news outlets increased on Telegram, and TV viewership has been a little bit down since the war started, although not dramatically. So on the one hand, we may see some erosion of trust in propaganda. But on the other hand, I would just remind you that state media are still very, very powerful, and state voices are still very influential. Again, Russians are still mostly learning news from state television. And the websites of independent media have about the same level, number of visits as before the war. So they've lost some audience because of the blockings. They've gained some new people, but they didn't dramatically increase their audience, except for on Telegram, as I mentioned. And also we have a lot of people who are pro-war, who are pro-state on YouTube and Telegram. And that's one of the reasons why these platforms are not yet blocked, because these people can be influential and sometimes more popular than independent journalists or opposition politicians. Plus, even if you look at the independent side or oppositional side, the quality of information is just getting objectively lower, because independent media are forced to operate from abroad. They have less funding. They cannot get access to the sources on the ground. So it's really hard for them to, or it's much harder for them to do quality reporting. And it's not to say they're doing a bad job. They're trying their best and often doing a good job, a great job, but still they are objectively constrained. But also in general, social media, and that's where most people turn to after that censorship was instituted, is a breeding ground for misinformation. And that's not only on the pro-state side, it's also on the sort of oppositional side. So we here see lots of rumors, conspiracy theories going on. For example, after this explosion on the Crimea bridge last week, we saw several stories spreading. Like, for example, there are mass military arrests in Russia, and people really shared this story because probably they wanted to be true, or they wanted to believe that regime is crumbling, that something bad is finally happening to Putin or to his military, but this was completely bogus. So we should just remember that. And to conclude, so I would just say that we shouldn't expect for propaganda to lose its power in the near term. We might see some erosion, some very slow erosion of trust in propaganda or willingness to go along with propaganda. But this is not happening right now. Or if it's happening, it's very slow. We cannot imagine to have protests like this, like we have in 1991, demanding freedom of speech or freedom of the press, maybe at some point in the future. And we also know that in some cases, authoritarian regimes collapse quickly, and trust in propaganda may also collapse very quickly. But for now, nothing indicates that that would happen in the next months or even in the next year. And finally, again, I also wanted to emphasize that although we should support independent journalists and they're doing an absolutely important work, we need information about Russia and coming from Russia. We shouldn't sort of delude ourselves thinking that if we support them, that then that would help bring propaganda down. Because so far, the majority of the Russian public did not care, has not cared about independent journalism, and it does not care about it now. So ultimately, I think propaganda will collapse when people in Russia stop demanding what it currently offers. So I will stop here. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First question, use the chair's prerogative. So that was a pretty somber note that you ended on, that propaganda is here to stay. You're welcome to sit here or up there. You seem to hint that if you think about this as a supply side or demand side problem, that there is abundant supply of independent media, and that your final comments that supplying more independent media is not going to change the way that propaganda is interpreted. So this seems like more of a demand side problem. So could you talk a little bit about, is this a messaging from independent media that they need to cover rosier topics and not just focus on the problems? Is this a fact-checking thing? Or, we've got a lot of research showing that fact-checking works, at least in Western democracies, and that people are able to recognize fake from truthful news if they're given the appropriate tools. how do you change the demand side of the equation for independent media? Or is this just all left up to the crumbling of the propaganda machine, and it will fall when it falls, and there's nothing to do?
Yeah, thank you. So I think it is a very sort of long-term and slow process. So I think in principle, we can't change the demand, but what has to be involved is education, and if education is under the government's control, right, there's not much we can do with it. On the part of independent media, it's also, I don't think it would be helpful for them to change, to nice, pleasant topics that will appeal to Russians, because basically, I think Russians are more or less set on what independent media are and what they're doing. So I think people won't believe that this media suddenly switched their side. And I think this is a problem with fact checking. So we know that sometimes fact checking works, but sometimes it backfires. And I think in the Russian case, that's what happened many times when independent media were trying to say, look, the government is lying to you about this. Look, this is not what happened. We have evidence, we have videos, we have eyewitnesses, we have all this. But people just said, no, you're just trying to manipulate us. And if people are set on something, I think in this case, fact checking can do sometimes worse. And this is, I think, what happened with independent. So to sum up, I cannot think of a clear solution that will help us, to bring Russians to consume high quality media within 2 years. Yeah. It must be something long term, and I think it's still important to, as I said, to support independent media because there will be demand for them at some point. So we have to be ready for that. But this moment is not.
Great, thank you. All right, let's take some questions. Yeah, if you just introduce yourself, and we don't have a mic in this room, so you speak loudly, and I will unfortunately repeat your question for the online audience so they can follow along.
Okay. My name is Roman Kalichak. I'm from the University in Ukraine. I have several questions, in fact. First question about you said about consistent narrative. It's not always consistent narrative because, like the case of Malaysia, Boeing, yes, there was like 7 versions. In case of Turkey, it was a lie, it was enemy, etc. So Russian audience accepted the same. It was not consistent. This is my first question. The second question about partial mobilization. So the question is quite simple. In this case, only the audience of independent channels, media are playing abroad. Because if you watch Russian TV, Russian is winning. No one is talking about casualties, etc., etc. So in case they should have some source of information on that they could be killed in Ukraine. Yes, this is my second question. And you stop short of saying it, but the general idea is that Russians are victims of propaganda. Yes. I think my conviction is this is a little bit different, that Russians are not victims of propaganda. State channels, state-owned channels, just expressing beliefs, convictions of Russian society. That's why the support of independent channels, etc. So this is, you mentioned this media literacy, etc., etc. It's all road to go. It's all way to go still. Yes. So maybe we should focus on this case on Russian society, because I don't buy this. Sorry, but the case of Russian mobilization is a good example. So in this case, it's not like the audience of state-owned channels.
Thanks. There's 3 questions. 1, how consistent is the narrative? 2, can Russians verify with their own eyes about partial mobilization, and then kind of validate whether or not the state is telling the truth? And are Russians victims of propaganda, or are they complicit?
Yeah, thanks. So the first question, yeah, I mean, when I said consistent narrative, I meant that this is something that you can find confirmation for somewhere else. And in all of those cases, all of those versions that were floating about the Malaysia Boeing, or the same thing happened, with the Skripal poisoning and other cases. You can find all those versions elsewhere in other state media. But you're right that this narrative is not internally consistent. Yes, it is consistent in the sense that it could be seen as consistent in the sense that you can find information. Yeah, maybe it's not the correct term. As for the second question, I mean, we don't know exactly who are fleeing this mobilization, but I think a lot of people who are or were the audiences of independent media have already fled either before the war or in the first months of the war. So at least a substantial portion of those who are fleeing are people who are consumers of state media, who are exposed to propaganda. And I think that's exactly the case of them not believing propaganda. This is not what they sign up for.
What are the sources of information?
I think social media, probably social media. I don't think they've learned about this. And to the third question, yes, that's exactly my point, right? So the Russians are not just brainwashed. They're not victims of like passive. I mean, they are passive anyway, but in this case, propaganda. They are. I wouldn't say that they are like the full lies precisely just with one side. But I think in this case, they are sort of co-creators of this, and they are at least partly responsible for the narratives that propaganda has been promoting. Because yes, propaganda has been focusing on the ideas that people already found plausible, and propaganda is kind of skillful in that sense because they look at what works, what doesn't work, they adapt, they pick up the narratives that and themes, ideas that people find convincing and appealing. So yeah, I would agree with you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, we have a question from the virtual audience, and that is that do you think that as younger and more tech-savvy generations with more diversified sources of news come up, will the hold on society of propaganda naturally flip?
Question about younger, more tech-savvy users. Will they have a different response to propaganda?
Well, that's what we would want, to see. That younger audiences would be more skeptical, more interested in independent media. In the Russian case, I would say, at least based on the experience of previous years, this wasn't the case. Most people who read independent media, watched independent media online, were people not very young people generally. And I think younger people in Russia mostly use social media. They just withdraw with news in general. So I think on the one hand, yes, they are more likely to get more accurate news when this news are promoted on social media. But on the other hand, on social media, you can also fall victim to misinformation. And also you can just get into a bubble where you don't have any news or any political stories at all. Where you just, and I think this is what happened with those people who are now fleeing mobilization. So they were just fine after the invasion happened. They were not thinking much about what's it going to do to them, what are the consequences, and how horrible this war is. They were just continuing their ordinary life in their small bubbles, and social media kind of kept that going. But only now, when there was a direct threat, they started fleeing, and even then, I'm not sure that substantially changed their political views or how they view this, how they view the regime.
Thanks. Any other questions from you? Yes.
I'm David Hoffman. Suppose you today were put in charge of efforts by the United States or Great Britain to reach Russian society. Assuming that we'll never really ever reach the state, but we have to reach society. Given all that you said, what would you recommend? We have tried all different ways, and I'm puzzled. Nothing really shows great success. So what do we do?
It's a question on what the US, UK could be doing to reach Russian society.
Yes, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer. I mean, I would love to be in charge of some effort funded by the government, but to be honest, I would probably say that I shouldn't waste too much money on that. yeah, I'm thinking about this, constantly, and I think there is probably something we could do besides, just supporting journalists, but many, as you said, many things that we tried, and many things that the activists tried. Like, for example, there were activists here in the spring and summer that were trying to reach out to Russians individually, like text them using random phone numbers and tell them the truth, or leave like reviews on Yandex, telling people about the war, and that didn't seem to have any impact either. So unfortunately, I think we have to accept that we cannot do much.
Yeah.
Mark first time. As Russian the Russian people bring Putin or NATO? Two, how does this war end?
As Russian casualties increase, will the Russian people blame Putin or NATO? And how will this war end? So two small questions for you.
Yes. So to the first one, I think they're still blaming NATO more. At least those people who are going along with propaganda. That's what propaganda is saying. That's because NATO has been supplying more advanced weapons, so that's a problem here. But I think they will start blaming Putin more the more this goes, and the more Putin himself will demand from the society in terms of next waves of civilization. How does this war end? Yeah, I think that's not a question one could answer right now. It doesn't seem that it would end quickly. It doesn't seem that at this point there is a negotiated solution out of the war. So yeah, this is a very this seems to be a long-term situation. Even if Putin is out of power, we're not sure about the war.
In your data, you present some of the binary between state media and independent. In other words, you frame that as sort of pro-Kremlin media and critical. For many Russians, independent media is a code word for pro-Western. Yet we've seen in the last 2 months, especially, that among some of the most critical Russian media are actually nationalist or hawkish Telegram channels, very widely read among. Do you have data, survey evidence, or any of the course that say pro-Kremlin, pro-government narrative oriented state media and the critical discourses is very different, even once the sunset?
Can you unpack state media between pro-Kremlin and sometimes critical Kremlin media that are still allowed to exist even when other independent shut down?
Yeah. So in my data, I was, as Julian suggested, I was somewhat simplifying this distinction. So I was looking, and I think at that point, the social media voices were not that distinct, to be honest, from the state media, because they were mostly before the war. So what I mean by state media is state television, state news outlets that are more or less established, like AP and OST. So I don't think I have any sort of empirical evidence of the distinction. Like generally, I would think that those voices would, based on what I've seen generally, I think those voices should, the pro-war voices that criticize the government, they should be seen as trustworthy because they have on many occasions shown that they are on Russia's side or on Russian side, that they really root for the Russian army. They want Ukraine to be defeated. So I think when such a channel starts criticizing the government, that sort of adds credibility. All this previous sort of stance on the war. So I would say that people would listen to them. But on the other hand, we should remember that I think there's only a minority of people who are actually interested in those kinds of information, and those people are probably already very nationalist, and I don't think that you could reach out to them with an alternative narrative.
I'm Harley Walter from Georgetown University, and I guess my question is what happened to the Russians? Those of us who spent long chunks of time in the 70s and 80s remember most of the people we knew could read between the lines of the newspapers and figure out what was going on. In 2011, 2012, people clearly had a pretty good sense of what was happening. That's why they were in the streets. Mikhail Dmitriev in 2018, 2019 had data that 70% of Russians thought that Russian foreign policy was a mistake. So where did all of that go away? Is the state media really that effective?
What happened to the Russians? And Russians have historically been good at parsing out propaganda, and even recently have shown those skills. Well, why is this different?
Yeah. So I think that this view somewhat overestimates the difference between then and now, because I think the people who were involved in those studies, like Elliott and others, and people that Westerners were in contact with, I think those were a specific category of Russians who were inclined to be more critical. I don't think we've had a good insight into into ordinary, typical Russians, and into how they think about politics, how they think about the regime. So I think those people who were critical, I think those people remain critical. But I don't think that the majority of the Russian public was as critical and skeptical even in Soviet times. And I don't think we could get at that because surveys in Soviet times were not possible. So we could only get to those people only through social media, personal connections, but through personal connections. And so what I'm saying is, I think you're right in that something happened to the Russian public, and it became more belligerent than it was before. And propaganda has played a role in it, but I also think that's kind of a bigger case than propaganda. I think it is like we know all those cases of post-imperial, trauma or whatever you call it, like when you lose spectacularly on the national arena, this leaves a lot of grievances that resurface at some point. And maybe my guess would be that in the first years of Putin's rule, those grievances did not yet manifest in this way because people were more worried about survival, about material well-being. But once they've solved some of those problems, and that's kind of outcome of the first to Putin's terms, right? The situation became much more tenable financially and materially. They started looking for something else, and I think that's what Dmitriev and other people were saying as well. People, this Crimea consensus, it is a consequence of people looking for something else besides, just having a full fridge, having a car. They wanted to feel great again, right? So I think that's.
Yaroslav Polinsky from Kyiv National University. I want to return to your main question. So why, and slightly go further. So why Russians trust their propaganda and don't trust me, and don't trust even their relatives and friends from Ukraine? In case of this war, because we have a lot of evidence. I think you know this movie by Loshak, when he filmed relatives from both sides and show us very openly that people don't trust even their relatives. So do you have any answer? Why?
Why is there so little trust among Russians, even for relatives, the information that they might get from those sources?
Yeah, well, I mean, without summarizing what they need to talk, I guess I would say that the main takeaway is that propaganda has made itself feel seen as trustworthy, and people just basically don't have a reason to switch the TV off, because generally the narrative that they see is comforting, it is familiar, it doesn't bother them. So it's not necessarily that every Russian is this hardcore nationalist or imperialist, but propaganda does enough to include this post-Soviet grievances, to address them, so that people feel okay with it, and so they don't have a reason to believe something else. Plus, I think you're also asking, I guess, it's not just why they don't believe the media, but also why it's so hard for them to believe that their country is waging an aggressive war, it's killing Ukrainians, and I think that's kind of a longer myth that goes back to the Soviet times, that we are not an aggressor, that Russia is only, defender of the world peace, and Russia has never been aggressive, Russia's never been an imperialist power, and I think this is a very strong sort of sentiment, strong belief among Russians that we cannot be that bad. So I think if you challenge it, if you're saying that there are war crimes that the Russian army is committing in Ukraine, that directly challenges that belief, and I think that also would force people to ask themselves very unpleasant questions, like what I've been doing all these years, why have I been listening to this, why have I been believing this, and people don't want it.
Do we have any evidence about why some people are more open to uncomfortable truths and some people are more closed, and how that changes over time? It seems like there's been in this country a large swath of the population that doesn't want to hear bad news and doesn't want to confront some inconsistencies in their belief system or encounter facts that may make them question some of their belief systems. And are Russians different in that way, or is this a product of propaganda to kind of enculture people to shy away from things that are uncomfortable and gravitate towards things that are comfortable or pleasant? I'm just speculating here, but we have a sense of how this operates psychologically?
I think it's a big question of whether being more conservative or more conspiratorial is the reason for believing those things, or whether or being more prone to critical narratives, challenges, or is it vice versa, that there are people who are educated in some way, and this is how they become more less conservative or less conspiratorial, whatever. And I don't think we know for sure. I think there are lots of similarities between what we see in the United States and we see in Russia. The difference is that in Russia it's
Well, it's not a small part of the country.
If you allow one more question.
Yeah, real quick. There's a couple of
Very
questions to the audience. So real quick, I'll take
So your mind, what has happened with Russians after the decay of the Soviet Union? Because in Soviet times, people much more trust one another than state propaganda. But now we have completely different situation. So how it has happened?
Great. David, and then I guess another hand.
Just quickly, I'm curious, in the 90s at least, there were lots of independent, and it was trusted. NTV, name a few, Subodnya, Kommersant. So as a starting point, instead of the Soviet period, he took that as a starting point for now. What's changed? Did the propaganda just get so much better?
And no red.
actually boil from online survey. Responded to that survey. Given the extent of the persecution on one hand, people responded, many people might be afraid to respond. On the other hand, those super might be ones who not
Great. So trust between people, what has happened, what's happened since the 1990s, and are your surveys representative? Is focused on that. And also the final word, since we're almost out of time.
Yeah. So as for what happened to people and trust between them, well, I think maybe it's my guess. I don't really know, but I think maybe the current Russian government was more successful portraying itself as something that represents the people and their interests than the Soviet government, and possibly because Putin was not afraid to tap into this more nationalist sentiment. Although, I mean, I'm not a specialist on the Soviet government, so I cannot be sure how accurate this assessment is. As for this question on 1990s, I think one difference between then and now is that back then a lot of people did not support the government. So independent media were also criticizing the government, but the government itself was seen as not very trustworthy. So maybe people were more inclined to believe NTV because they just didn't trust Yeltsin as much, and many people just hated. But that's not the only reason. And I think you're right that propaganda got better. They became more professional, but they also got more resources. They were able to spend a lot of money on production quality, on wiring, entertainment, which is also one thing I didn't touch upon. But entertainment is something that draws people to television. But then the key thing is that they stay for the news and they don't turn off during the news. That means that news should also be available. And as for the last question about representativeness, I think this is a valid concern. On the one hand, I don't think that there is a reason to think that people were afraid, because that wasn't this year. I did surveys in 2020, 2019, 2021, when there was less persecution, and people were less afraid. Plus, I did some. I don't want to go into this, but I used some techniques to basically make them think less about the political sensitivity of those questions. But you're right that those surveys mostly do not represent for the most part, they're not entirely representative, if that makes sense. On the one hand, there are lots of people who are online in Russia. Most people are online. But on the other hand, my surveys are specifically about people who are more receptive online. So I think we should treat this evidence as evidence about people who are users of social media, people who are internet users. And these people are important because these are the people who could go out on the streets in principle and protest. These are people who actually pay more attention to news content. So I'm not saying that this is a representative snapshot of the public, although I do have a survey that used a national representative sample, and I got similar results. But I think this is a valid concern. That I'm happy to talk more about this. Lots of questions.
Well, Anton, thank you very much. I think you seeded one of your questions that maybe Netflix and EV are the way to change Russian society if they're drawn to entertainment through streaming services. But if you have any other questions, please come and see Anton after the talk. I'm sorry we didn't have time for everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Let's give Anton a very thank you. Join us next month for the next edition of New Voices on Eurasia, and we'll continue some of these conversations. Oh, it's great. It's fantastic.
Can I take a photo of all these